So hello to everyone watching this video, especially to our Sustainable Tourism Professor, Ms. Rocelyn Rom, and to our beloved classmates from BSTM 1A Day Batch 2021 to 2022. In this report, we are going to be tackling about wildlife tourism. So by the way, we are the reporters for today. First, we have Ms. KHERA CAPUTOLAN. Second, we have LEIZEL MENDOZA. And yours truly, RHEA Jane Valles. So before we formally start the discussion, we have prepared for you guys a mini activity. It is called 4 Pics, 1 Word, and here it is. You just can leave your answers in the comment section. This is the first slide and this is the second. So if you are done entering your answers, let's proceed to the formal discussion. So objectives. Within this session, the students will be able to define wildlife tourism, describe the contribution of wildlife tourism to conservation, analyze the relationship of economics to wildlife tourism and business issues. Lastly, explain on how to manage the impacts of wildlife tourism. So let's start. Understanding wildlife tourism. Let us understand what this means just by defining each word. So what is wildlife? Wildlife traditionally refers to undomesticated animal species, but has come to include all organisms that grow or live wild in an area without being introduced by humans. Wildlife can be found in all ecosystems, deserts, forests, rainforests, plains, grasslands, and other areas, including the most developed urban areas, all have distinct forms of wildlife. So it basically means that animals that live in wild country, these animals include amphibians, reptiles, fish, mammals, birds, and invertebrates. Next, we have tourism. What is tourism? Tourism is a social, cultural, and economic phenomenon which entails the movement of people to countries or places outside their usual environment for personal or business or professional purposes. So tourism is an overall agglomeration of activities, services, and involves sectors that make up the unique tourist experience. Next in line, we have wildlife tourism. This is a sum up definition of this word. Wildlife tourism is basically a tourism based on encounters with non-domesticated animals. Wildlife tourism has been heralded as a way to secure sustainable economic benefits while supporting wildlife conservation and local communities. Next in line, we have this picture. This indicated where these animals, wild animals, originated. Just like these penguins, they are originally located at the Antarctica, and also this whale. And this camel, this is specifically at the Dubai, in the Asia, Dubai. And of course, these wild animals that we commonly know, the giraffe and the tiger lion, and the zebra at the Africa. So next. So humans have historically tended to separate civilization from wildlife in a number of ways, including the legal, social, and moral sense. So some animals, however, have adapted to suburban environments. These include such animals as domesticated cats, dogs, mice, and herbies, where we commonly see this in our households and also in the streets. So in some religions, they declare certain animals to be sacred. And in modern times, concern for the natural environment has provoked activists to protest against the exploitation of wildlife for human benefit or entertainment, where they usually use this for in the zoo. So wildlife tourism has three factors. First, we have increased interest from wildlife management professionals and non-government wildlife organizations and synergies. Second, we have wild animals are increasingly used by marketers in some countries. Third, we have from many tourists, wild animals are of particular interest compared with the other elements of the natural environment. So wildlife tourism includes a very diverse set of experiences, and classifying different forms or attributes of these experiences can be useful for a variety of purposes. So there are classifications of wildlife tourism. First, we have wildlife watching tourism. This basically means viewing or otherwise interacting with free-ranging animals. Second, we have captive wildlife tourism. This means viewing animals in man-made confinement, principally zoos, wildlife parks, animal sanctuaries, and aquaria. Second to the last, we have hunting tourism. It includes killing of wild land animals. Lastly, we have fishing tourism. This is where we can explore some fishing activities like capturing some fish. Next. So in this table, this indicates the major international destinations for wildlife watching. So for example, in this region from Eastern and Southern Africa, especially from South Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and Rwanda. So as mentioned lately, this is where we can, as I've mentioned lately, in Africa, we can see some large mammals like the giraffe. So large mammals or sometimes bird watching as part of safari game lodge experience, principally in public protected areas. Also private game reserves, especially in South Africa. Mammals with high diversity, high abundance, large body size, and open plains and places with large vistas make it easy to find and observe wildlife. Penguins and whales in marine and coastal areas in southern, and hippos and crocodiles in wetlands and rivers. The next. Negative effects of wildlife tourism and wildlife. Wildlife tourism can result in a range of negative effects. These vary from short-term changes in physiology or behavior of individual animals to long-term effects. So the negative effects of the wildlife tourism is dependent on the changes that the animals make. The severity of negative effects of wildlife varies considerably with the animal itself. Severity will also vary with type, frequency, and intensity of wildlife tourism. So the seriousness of the effects of any tourism activity on wildlife can clearly vary from mild discomfort or inconvenience to local or global extinction of a species or disruption of communities and ecosystems, and it is not always easy to determine where a particular effect is likely to lie along the spectrum. So to continue this topic, let me call on Miss KHERA May Caputolan to discuss the contribution of wildlife tourism to conservation. Miss KHERA?
So hi everyone. So I will be discussing about contribution of wildlife tourism to conservation. So as you can see in the diagram shown in the PowerPoint presentation, so first, direct wildlife management and supporting research. So wildlife management must be based on detailed knowledge of the varieties of species, their total populations, sex ratio, and other population characteristics upon which viable and sustainable game cropping depends. So wildlife management is an applied science, methods, and techniques for both research and implementation are important. So as a result, a considerable amount of research has been directed at developing, assessing, and improving techniques. So techniques for managing wildlife are aimed at studying, reducing, increasing, or maintaining the population at its current level while securing its integrity. So the second one is finances for conservation. So most of the federal programs relevant to wildlife management and conservation are funded from general tax revenue, such as personal and corporate income taxes. So here are some of the ways that wildlife conservation efforts are funded includes first, federal budget appropriations, second, clean energy and climate legislation, third, leases for energy production that occurs on public land or offshore, fourth, farm bill conservation programs, and lastly, environmental damage mitigation costs. So the third one is socio-economic benefits to operator or host community. So the host community is a fundamental component of any tourism system. Wildlife tourism activities have many impacts on a host community. Therefore, any increase in wildlife tourism as a recreational pursuit will inevitably or accompanied by a growth in numbers of local people affected by tourism. So the host community is an important element to consider in the concept of sustainability. The sustainability of wildlife tourism is dependent, in part, on its support from the area's residents. Host satisfaction is related to both the involvement of local community members in wildlife tourism activities and the benefits that disadvantages of wildlife tourism to host communities. So the fourth one is education of visitors. So the main example for this one is when we are going on a trip, like we are going on a zoo. So zoo offers opportunities to educate visitors about habitat conservation through programs and activities, and the way individual habitats and zoos are being designed. Education about wildlife and habitat conservation is very important and must address scientific, aesthetic, and ecological values to be effective. So the fifth one is political pressure for conservation. The conservation movement, also known as nature conservation, is a political, environmental, and social movement that seeks to manage and protect natural resources, including animals, fungus, and plant species, as well as their habitat for the future. So habitat conservation is management practice that seeks to conserve, protect, and restore habitats and prevent species extinction, fragmentation, or reduction in range. It is a priority of many groups that cannot be easily characterized in terms of any one ideology. So preserving habitats is essential to preserving biodiversity. Migratory species are particularly vulnerable to habitat destruction because they tend to inhabit more than one natural habitat. Altering a natural habitat even slightly can result in a domino effect that harms the entire ecosystem. Next slide, please. So the host community and wildlife tourism. Wildlife tourism activities have many potential impacts on a host community, and the host community can impact on wildlife tourism activities. The host community encompasses all aspects of wildlife tourism not covered by either wildlife or the tourist. It could be seen as comprised of many stakeholder groups at the supply end of tourism. Hosts can be directly or indirectly with wildlife tourism, or not involved at all. Host community may regard wildlife as a valuable resource to be exploited either for self-consumption or for commercial consumption. So the host community is a very important element to consider in the concept of sustainability. So social and cultural issues need to be considered because of the importance of host acceptance to the overall sustainability of a wildlife tourism attraction. So determining how to make a wildlife tourism attraction sustainable from the perspective of the host community requires an understanding of the interplay of elements affecting both the perception of and support for that tourism. So next, the relationship between host and sustainability. So sustainability should be a goal for all wildlife tourism ventures, and the role of the host community must be acknowledged. So host perceptions of wildlife tourism are attitudes and values. So according to Jaworski et al. 1997-3, achieving the goal of favorable community support for the tourism industry requires an understanding of how residents should formulate their attitudes towards tourism. Next slide, please. So here are some barriers to satisfactory host engagement with wildlife tourism. First, lack of education. So a lack of education can be defined as a state where people have a below average level of common knowledge about basic things that they would urgently need in their daily life. For instance, this could include basic knowledge in math, writing, spelling, and etc. So people who lack education have trouble getting ahead in life, have worse health, and are poorer than the well-educated. So major effects of lack of education includes poor health, lack of a voice, shorter lifespan, unemployment, exploitation, and gender inequality. So the last one is lack control of the industry. The second one is lack of capital. So lack of capital can result in not having enough to, to cover overhead expenses, funding expansion opportunities, or launching a new product to market. And the last one is lack control of the industry. So controlling is the final but an important step of the management process. So without effective controlling, management process cannot be completed. Management cannot achieve desired goals and results without controlling. Next slide, please. So potential benefits of host engagement to wildlife tourism. So it can provide beneficial healthcare, education, food, and may contribute to the reduction of poverty. It can also provide long-term revenue generation, assist conservation, and raise the living standards of host communities. Hosts received through direct and indirect benefits. It also provides benefits to existing local businesses, new businesses, jobs publicity, and increased environmental awareness. And lastly, it brings considerable foreign exchange into a country. So, one compelling benefit that comes from wildlife conservation efforts is that it ensures food security, protection forests from deforestation, and rebuilding forest habitats to preserve biodiversity aids in the carbon sequestering process. It provides new economic opportunities and guards against erosion. Next slide, please. So problems that may result from host engagement with wildlife tourism. So first, disposition. Second, loss of access to resources. Third, competition and conflict over the distribution of funds. Fourth, asymmetrical power relations. Fifth, degradation of natural environment. Sixth, increasing commodity and property prices. And the last one is increase the economic burden on local people. Next slide, please. So, economics of wildlife tourism. Economics has a variety of applications to wildlife tourism. It estimates of the impact of expenditures by wildlife tourists on incomes and employment. Consideration of the economic value of wildlife for satisfying common human wants for tourism and other purposes, and the implications of these values for the optimal economic management of resources, including wildlife. It also used economic policy instruments to achieve improved outcomes from wildlife tourism. So wildlife provides us the raw and basic material to start any industry, factory for our earnings. Wildlife is also considered to be one of the greatest factors for increase and better development of world trade and increase in national income. Next slide, please. So this table indicates the classification of economic instruments for managing wildlife tourism. So to continue our discussion, may I call in Ms. LEIZEL Mendoza.
So hi everyone. So for today, to continue our report, I'm gonna be tackling about understanding wildlife tourism markets. So why do we need to understand wildlife tourism markets? So according to Hall and MacArthur 1993, in the field of protected area management, which includes government agencies responsible for wildlife management, marketing is often seen as negative term because it is associated with commercial interest and sales. So according to them, in line with government agencies responsible for wildlife management, marketing is understood as negative term for the reason that it is associated with commercial interest and sales. So when we say commercial interest, it refers to the ownership of businesses within the country. And sales refers to the number of goods sold. Though they understand it that way, if we understood marketing according to its definition, it is, however, about determining who the customers are or stakeholders are, what their needs are, what expectations and motivations they have, what they currently do, and how they can be influenced or persuaded to act in ways that match the goals. So in marketing, it determines who the customers or stakeholders are or the people involved in the management. They provide their needs, like what their expectations and motivations, what they currently do, and also through marketing, it talks about on how it could influence or persuade the acts or ways that would match the goals of the setting managers. Next slide. So there are three main reasons for studying wildlife tourism markets. So first is to guide the planning of infrastructure and services. So it helps the management to organize their plans and services to provide quality visitor experiences and to eliminate the negative impacts of wildlife tourism on the wildlife and their environment. The second one is to determine the nature of the visitor markets and its factors. So through it, it contributes to its satisfaction with wildlife tourism opportunities so as to provide quality experiences. The third one is to understand visitor behavior. So it is important to understand the visitor's behavior so that we would know how it could influence so as to effectively manage negative impact of wildlife tourism and encourage positive outcomes such as greater conservation awareness and support. Next slide. So understanding how to manage visitors in wildlife tourism setting. So there are ways like in order to understand how to manage visitors in wildlife tourism settings. First is interactions. Interactions are the activities that human engage in that have direct or indirect impacts on natural systems. In the case of wildlife tourism, these are the actions that visitors take that have impacts on the wildlife and or the environment in which they are viewed. Next one is demands. These are the forces that generates the activities. So an example of this feature of human use can be found in the issue of fish feeding on coral reef day trips. If evidence indicated that feeding fish to attract them to moorings or visited areas had detrimental effects on the fish, then an understanding of the forces that encourage this activity would be necessary. If the demand for the activity came from the visitors who had no other way to view fish, then a solution might involve the development of alternative fish viewing opportunities. The next one is values. So values are the significance, meaning utility or priority attached by the individuals or culture to material or non-material matters that form the basis of human thoughts. In the case of wildlife tourism, it is an understanding of the values that visitors attach to seeing wildlife is important in influencing conservation efforts and in setting prices and fees for wildlife viewing opportunities. Perceptions. So perceptions are what people believe or know. So perceptions are based in part of the experience, but also on culture, education, and communication, and in turn influence attitudes and behavior. Understanding human perception is very important because it managed the wildlife tourism in a number of ways. Next. So as you can see in a concept, it talks about the mindfulness model of wildlife-based tourist experiences. So the model incorporates predictions from a mindfulness approach with what is known about the features associated with visitor satisfaction from previous wildlife viewing research. So the models thus serve as both a summary of the existing research and also begins to suggest predictions related to behavior, visitor behavior and responses in wildlife tourism settings. So as you can see, it has setting condition, visitor characteristic, visitor wildlife experience, wildlife characteristic, and outcomes. So this model provides some directions for dealing with management challenges. It predicts that visitors will respond favorably to opportunities to touch and handle wildlife because it involves a multi-sensory experience. It offers an intense interactive experience and it provides visitors with greater control over the interactions. So these are all the factors that have been found to be related to mindfulness. Furthermore, a mindfulness approach offers a number of dimensions of principles for designing more structured and rewarding wildlife tourism experiences. Next, BB. So business issues in wildlife tourism. Business involved in wildlife tourism range from large commercial concerns through small businesses, community-based enterprises, not-for-profit, and government-owned operations of all sizes. In addition, there are many businesses that incorporate a wildlife component into their operation. So, business issues in wildlife tourism takes into account the varied business needs of different enterprises by adopting a strategic approach towards the business of wildlife tourism. So when we say small businesses, it refers to the tours of public land or water, farm stays that incorporate a wildlife component, fishing, hunting parties, small zoos, conservation parks, and research stations. And the community-based enterprises, not-for-profit, and government-owned operations of all sizes are different structures involved in business management. It could complex field basic business theory and can be applied to address the main recurrent issues that small to medium wildlife tourism enterprises face. Next, BP. So, managing impacts of wildlife tourism. Wildlife tourism can have negative and positive impacts on animals that are subject of or otherwise affected by such activities. Management regimes that facilitate these are critical for environment and industry perspective. So from our reports, you could see the impacts, the positive and negative impacts reported by Ms. RHEA Jane of wildlife tourism. So knowing and managing the impacts of wildlife tourism is vital to the ecological and economic sustainability of wildlife tourism, that wildlife populations, the resources on which businesses depend are not damaged, and it is desirable that their conservation or welfare will be enhanced. Next, BB. So in order to effectively manage or the impacts of wildlife tourism, so there are ways to effective management program. First is clear stated and agreed management objectives usually link into broader goals. So it is important to provide an objective that is clearly stated and agreed by a management that would in line to broaden your goals. It should include a statement about desired status of wildlife and habitat, indicators and standards. Indicators are sign of progress towards achieving a specific outcome. Standards are a level of quality or attainment. So these specify when the objectives are considered to have been achieved. The third one is appropriate choice and implementation of management actions. So this is designed to meet these objectives. the fourth one is a suitable monitoring program. So a suitable monitoring program should have an effective mechanism for feedback from evaluation of monitoring into management action. Fifth is an adequate process for stakeholder participation. So these are all the key stages of the management process. Number six, a clearly documented process. So it brings the above elements together in a cyclical fashion and guides ongoing management. Next one, B. So the role of interpretation in wildlife tourism. According to Tilden, interpretation is an educational activity which aims to reveal meanings and relationships through the use of original objects by first-hand experience and by illustrative media, rather than to simply communicate factual information. So, interpretation broadly refers to the educational activities used in places like zoos, museums, heritage sites, and national parks to tell visitors about the significance or meaning of what they are experiencing. Also, interpretation aims to stimulate interest, promote learning, guide visitors in an appropriate behavior for sustainable tourism, and encourage enjoyment and satisfaction. So in order to understand more about wildlife interpretation, there are like types of wildlife interpretation that could help the visitors encourage to learn about to appreciate animals they are viewing. So first is interpretive signs. Interpretive signs is a signage that helps to create a narrative that acts to generate a positive user experience. So interpretive signs is usually seen in like zoos, museums, and like in the entrance of zoos and museums. Models are a system or a thing used in as an example to follow or imitate. Brochures are informative paper documents. Guides are a person who advises or shows the way to others. Demonstrations are the actions or process of showing the existence of truth by giving proof or evidence. And lastly, on shows, videos, audio, commentary, computers, and books are all types of wildlife interpretation. Wildlife tourism, a strategic destination analysis. So, a holistic perspective in wildlife tourism. Holistic understanding of issues relating to wildlife tourism requires it to be seen within a society wide context rather than just a form of tourism. When we say holistic, it is relating to or concerned as a whole rather than the individual. So a holistic perspective in wildlife tourism covers all the possible connections of wildlife tourism in the environment or the people. Next, please. So the context of wildlife tourism. Tourism is presented as separated or but overlapping with recreation as it involves additional elements such as accommodation. So in the context, it shows the form of tourism and how it should not be viewed in isolation. Particularly in the case of wildlife watching tourism, aspects of visitor experience that relate to wildlife are often combined with other elements of the natural environment and may also be combined with cultural, adventure, or other forms of tourism. Indeed, for example, there may be unrealized opportunities for integrating wildlife tourism and cultural tourism in ways that enhance the visitor experiences of both elements. Nevertheless, issues has been presented and are specific to use in wildlife tourism. So the current status of wildlife tourism is that wildlife tourism has evolved dramatically over recent decades and composed an identifiable trends over this period. So as the years pass by, wildlife tourism keeps growing and productive. Like the people will has actually like recognized the life of wildlife tourism. So there are like ways that the current status of wildlife tourism has shown. So first is increased involvement of the commercial tourism industry. It has increased levels of participation in at least some form of wildlife tourism, diversification of wildlife watching opportunities, increased environmental awareness, increased sophistication in product design, increased use of interpretation, especially in captive settings, increased use of technology to facilitate wildlife viewing, some blurring of the distinction between captive and free-ranging wildlife tourism. All of these are evidence on how the wildlife tourism keeps growing as the years pass by. So that would be all, guys. That's all about our report. Thank you.
So that will be all with our discussion about wildlife tourism, and we will be conducting a learning activity hosted by Miss Rocelyn Rom in our G classroom. And we hope that you learned something, and thank you so much for watching. Bye!